Erev Tov, good evening. So, many weeks ago, a few months ago, Pesach approaches me with the title he is interested in for this class. And that is Purim in the days of the Gemara. Now, I'll give you pshat in what I think Pesach Purim means. I'll give you pshat. I hope my pshat is correct. And it works as follows. That often when you have a talk, when you have a lecture about Purim, it will relate to the story in Megillas Esther, the narrative, how different commentators read it. Perhaps you're going to have a lecture or class that will address the halachot, the practices. But what Pesach was interested in was more how it was practiced. In other words, what was the Purim about in different periods, and specifically in the days of the Gemara. So that's what he wanted to know. So I started to prepare, and after the foreman's wife left to Israel, I realized that I have some flexibility in the shul. So I actually added to the title, and beyond. So if you look carefully, if one day someone's going to write a dissertation on the history of Bnei Torah, or if an archaeologist finds our bulletins in 2,000 years from now, they'll notice that there was a shift. And then they're going to go ahead, and if they are good, they're going to go through the archives of Air Canada or El Al and realize that the president wasn't here, and they'll figure out that the rabbi was able to do what he wants and add a word to a title. Welcome back. Now, with that, we're going to go ahead and analyze different periods. We're going to go through different periods. Now, when you say in the days of the Gemara, what were the days of the Gemara? The Gemara records history of 1,000 years or more. So what do you mean the days of the Gemara? So, we're going to go ahead and progress historically. We're going to start many, many centuries before the Talmud. We're going to go ahead and address a little bit about the era of the Talmud itself and the spirit of Purim beyond. Now, number one, if we would go ahead and place ourselves in some kind of time tunnel. There was a program in the late 60s on TV. Also, you can see a few nods. The reason I know what's happening in the late 60s is because I was in the early 80s in Israel, and that's when we got those programs. So there was something called the time tunnel of two fellows that would travel. It was a way, it was educational. You could teach people history. So we're going to enter into that time tunnel, and we're going to land, let's say, about the year 80 before the Common Era. Okay, it's a good time. So, but we're going to enter into Yerushalayim. We have a level of independence there. We gained independence after the Hashmonaim. We had some problematic kings, but nevertheless, we had our independence. We're linked to Rome. We're linked to the Roman culture. But if, let's say, I land on the 13th of Adar, the 13th end of Adar, okay, what we would call the day before Purim. So I walk and I meet someone, and what am I expecting? I'm coming from the 21st century.
He's hungry.
It's an afternoon. I'm expecting them to be a little bit hungry. Why? It's a fast day, right? It's a fast day. I expect them to being on the way, to shul, to go ahead and read the Megillah. I expect them to figure out by then have a theme of what their Shalach Manas is about, right? Matching colors or some kind of involvement with Sudas Purim. And if I turn to them and I say hello, they will respond, oh, a good yontif, they would say to me. A good yontif. I would say a good yontif, and they would say yes. Or they would say, Yom Nikanor Sameach. That's how I was greeted in the year 80 before the Common Era. Yom Nikanor Sameach. What does that mean? Well, it works as follows. There's an ancient text that's called Megillat Ta'anit that gives us a list of days that they celebrated for the last 200 years of the Second Temple. It gives us a list of days of victories, days we were succeeded in overcoming the challenges from the Greeks. Among those dates mentioned is the 13th of Adar. That on the 13th of Adar, there was this evil general by the name of Nicanor. Nicanor himself would go ahead and stretch out his arm and proclaimed that I am waiting for that day, she'etotz et hamigdal hazeh. He would point towards the temple in Jerusalem, and he would say, I am waiting for the day to uproot that castle, to uproot that migdal, that tower. And then eventually there was a battle that occurred. They killed Nicanor, and they chopped off his arm and his head. According to some, they presented it on a staff facing Jerusalem. Whatever it is, the day was a day to celebrate. They beat Nicanor. So that was Yom Nicanor. So first thing is I would be greeted with Yom Nicanor Sameach. Number two, I would say to them, what about Tainis Esther, I would ask. They would respond, Tainis who? What are you talking about? There was no such thing as a Tainis Esther. It was a Yom Tov. What do you mean a fast day? This is not a fast day. It is Yom Nicanor. And if I would say to them, yeah, but isn't tonight Purim? They would say, yeah, it seems to be. Now, there is a text. This is not canonized. But nevertheless, it's a text that is known as the Book of the Maccabees. There are two editions and there are variations. These books present to us the history of the Hashmonaim and their victories against the Greeks. In Book 2 of the Hashmonaim, where we are told about the story of Nicanor, it notes that the day of celebration, the 13th of Adar, happens to be the day prior to Yom Mordechai, to the day of Mordechai. So Purim was called by some groups as the day of Mordechai. Okay, so that's what we know. So obviously the individual I meet would be familiar with what Purim is about to some extent. Now, what you have to remember, we had a discussion a few weeks ago, Thursday night, at a Talmud shir, about the fact that there are so many disputes in the Talmud about what should be done in the Bet HaMikdash. Do you first slaughter that thing or do you first sprinkle that thing? Many, many questions, and the rabbis have their disagreements. Many scholars and students of Talmud wonder, why are they having so many disagreements? Why not just ask some Alta Yid, an Alta Kohen, who remembers the temple and how the service was done, and he can verify how indeed the service was performed? This is a question that many ask because there are so many such questions in the Talmud. There are so many disagreements among scholars who only lived 3 decades after the destruction of the temple. And I presented the following explanation, that you should know the Second Temple period, especially the last few decades. The temple in Jerusalem was the Wild West. There were different forces. The Judaism we know today was not the Judaism of then. There was indeed one group, which they have been identified as the Pharisees. They had their type of Judaism. But there were many different Jews with different philosophies. We hear about the Sadducees, we hear about the Essenes, we hear about all kinds of different individuals and different groups and different philosophies and approaches to Judaism. So therefore, it is very possible that the Purim we are familiar with, the Purim that comes with Mishlach Manot Ish Le'Re'eu, Umatanot Le'Evyonim, and the awareness that there's something called the Megillas Esther and there's a mitzvah to read it, that was practiced by some. Others practiced it in some different ways and perhaps called it a different name. The rabbis actually had an agenda, and their agenda was to publicize the Purim that we know, what we call Pirsum Hanes. The rabbis came up with a leniency that despite the fact that in the Megillah we are told that there are 2 days designated for the reading of the Megillah, nevertheless, you should go ahead and read it, if needed, even on the 11th of the month, and even on the 12th, and even on the 13th. The rabbis had a desire that even individuals and people living in small villages should have access to the reading of the Megillah and should be familiar with the story, because there were different groups that were less familiar with it. So that's what's taking place if we begin in that period. You know, the rabbis in the Talmud tell us that you could read the Megillah in a foreign language. You could read it legiftim be'igiftit. If you meet a group of Jews who only speak Egyptian, read the Megillah to them in Egyptian. This is what's mentioned in the Talmud. That is 100% fine. Why? The rabbis had an agenda. We want everyone to become familiar with this event. That's what the rabbis wanted. That's what should be done. It's interesting to note that come Spain, the late 14th century, so there was a rabbi, Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Sheshet Perfet, and he gets a question from Sarasota, where there was a specific rabbi who allowed a Spanish reading of the Megillah in Spanish. And there was a big to-do because other rabbis were uncomfortable with it, right? And they note that there's some things that we're not sure how to translate. So it became a major thing because despite the fact that the rabbis who established the Purim, who put it in play the way it is practiced, had a desire that everyone should be involved, and thus we can read it in so many languages. Later on, the rabbis were trying to cut out other languages. This is something to address at some other time. But we're visiting. We're still in that period. And that's the feeling we get of Purim prior to the day of the Gemara. We're going to move forward a little bit to the actual days of the Gemara. Now, Purim itself, number one, it is identified by drunkenness. That's a reality. There's a statement in the Talmud. A person should go ahead and leave this sunnah. The Talmud shares this awful story of Rabbah and Rab Zera, when Rab Zera goes ahead and slaughters Rabbah. Why? Because he was so drunk. It was a Tchiyat HaMetim. Drunkenness plays a role. It's interesting to note that, our siddur, the way we have it today, it went through different stages. And there was a period, it was extremely popular in Europe from the 10th and 11th century on, to add yotzros and to add all kind of piyutim, and they had names for them. What you add in Shachris is known as the Ofanim, and these are prayers that expanded tefillah. It was really a format of communication and education. People did not have access to books. People did not read. They did come for prayer. So in the prayer itself, they would add within the tefillah, within the brachos of Mariv, they would add these piyutim that tell you about the spirit of the day and the essence of the day. And in the Machzor Vitri, which is a very significant text because it is based on the teachings of Rashi, they share with us one of these piyutim that they would add in the first blessing of Mariv. Hama'ariv Aravim, they would go ahead and add the following. Listen carefully. Leil Shikurim Hu Zeh Halayla. It is a night of drunkenness. Even though the Talmud mentions that drunkenness is more of the day. Lismoach beyayin atov v'legilah. Nice word. So this is what was mentioned. Drunkenness really became the identity of the holiday. It's interesting to note that in that tefillah of Ma'ariv, it mentions there that it's important to treat Purim as a Yom Tov, and therefore, Arur Ha'ish, cursed be the person, Asher Yochal Adashim, whoever eats lentils. It's a day to celebrate, don't eat lentils. We're not exactly sure what that means, but there's a very logical explanation. That on it, well?
Morning.
It's morning. It's a sign of morning. Good. Sign of morning. But there's a little bit more. There seems to be other sources that indicate that beans was not a food that you eat on a Yom Tov. Beans is a Nebach food. So Yom Tov, you shouldn't be eating beans. And according to some, there's actually a school that believes that the whole kitnios practice started with that. That of course you don't eat kitnios on Pesach. It's beans. You should be eating beans, and you should be eating good things. So according to some, that's how all of kitnios started. So this is a day. The author of this statement wants us to know it is a real Yom Tov. Arur Ra'ish Asher Yochal Adashim. So just recheck your menu at home and be sure that there are no Adashim.
What about Shoah and
Shoah, okay.
Especially as meat.
It has meat, so the meat balances it. It balances it out, perhaps indeed. Okay, I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to move forward to late 15th century. Okay, you'll allow me to move fast forward to late 15th century. There, among the poskim, among the great poskim of that era, was Rabbi Yehuda Mintz. Rabbi Yehuda Mintz. His descendants carried the name Katzenellenbogen, and that was a very well respected in rabbinic communities. I wish I would be a Katzenellenbogen, because it's a real cool, it's a difficult name to pronounce for some perhaps, but it's a cool name, right? The cat's elbow, right? The cat's elbow. Anyway, So Rabbi Yehuda Mintz, is a well-recognized posek. His grandchildren are poskim, his great-grandchildren. And he wrote many, many tshuvos. Many, many, many tshuvos. He lands up, he's born in Germany, lands up as a rabbi in northern Italy in Padua. Padua, I've been to Padua. How far from Venice is it? I think only a couple miles to the west. And he's a well-respected authority there. He writes many, many tshuvos. Unfortunately, right after his passing in 1508 or 1509, there was some kind of major battle in the region, and the bulk of his responsa and his novella on Talmud was destroyed. What is left is basically 16 shuvot, and that's it. A posek that wrote hundreds, we're left with 16. Okay, this is unfortunate, but it's published and printed many, many, many times. There's fascinating information. It's quoted by halachic authorities. These are 16 precious tshuvot. What's interesting to note is that even in the few tshuvot we have, we identify one of his nemesis, a person that he really did not like. And the rabbi didn't like appears, believe it or not, 16 tshuvot. In 2 of the tshuvot, he is attacking this rabbi. So it must be that he really, imagine if we would have all the tshuvot. The name of the rabbi, and I do hope that nobody here or anyone watching is a descendant, and if yes, I ask for forgiveness. Okay, but I'll roll up my sleeves. Rolf's not here, so let's go for it. The name of his nemesis was a rabbi by the name of Gershon Bonifacio. Bonifacio, I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Now, Rabbi Gershon Bonifacio's psakim were attacked by Rabbi Yehuda Mintz. Okay, one of them dealt with the following issue. There was a man married to a woman. There were no children. He had a desire to marry another woman without divorcing his wife. He was told, what about cherem of Rabbeinu Gershon? So, Rabbeinu, he dealt with the question, turns to Gershon ben Nefacha, and ben Nefacha says, I have a psak from Rabbi Eliyahu Mizrahi, the great rabbi in Turkey, that yes, there is such a thing as a cherem Rabbeinu Gershon, but in a situation where you want to fulfill the mitzvah of Purim of having children, don't worry about it. That's ben Nefacha's psak. And comes Mahari Mintz, Rabbi Yehuda Mintz, and he calls him, this is a psak of a tzduki, a muchram. He becomes ballistic with this psak of ben Nefacha. Now, there's another psak that ben Nefacha has, which Mahari Mintz is extremely upset. There seemed to be a practice at that time that on Purim, people would wear, number one, partsufim. Partsufim, like masks, right? Masquerades. That's what they would wear. Number two, what else would they do on Psulim? That people would cross-dress. Shinui bigdei me bigdei ish le bigdei isha. You want to get dressed up, right? So there was no, Target was not going out of business in Venice. So what would they do? You couldn't get a cheap costume there. So husband takes wife's clothes, wife takes husband's clothes, and that's what they would do. Now there's actually a Torah prohibition of lo yilbash. You're not supposed to. So can we allow this? So Ben Nefacha believed that it's totally prohibited. You're violating a Torah law, and therefore he was against it. Comes Mahari Mintz, and he notes that I can testify that I saw Gdolei v'chasidei olam. I saw the greatest of authorities. And they were people, these righteous people, saw their bneihem ubnotehem, these righteous chasidei olam, saw their children, v'chatnehem v'chalotehem, and their daughter-in-laws and son-in-laws, lovshim otan partsufim, they were wearing the masks, and they would switch the clothes, and they had no problem with it, because if there would have been any concern, they would have said something. And he notes that you are quoting to me what Bonifacio thinks. Don't worry about him, because he's a palga, meaning he's a person that separated himself from the community. He's a tzduki umuchram. He didn't like him. He called him a person who was excommunicated. and he is a person who is medaber and meharer achar mitatan shel gdolei olam. He questions great rabbinic authorities. He was extremely disturbed with Bonafacio. He gives his psak that it is fine for Simchas Purim. This became a significant psak because 80 years later, Ramosha Isilis, known to us as the Ramah in Poland, in Krakow, in Shulchan Aruch notes that the custom that people have to cross-dress is permissible. Where does he get his source for it? Rabbi Yehuda Mintz. So this became the significant norm. Now, it's interesting that if you ask someone, masks on Purim, costumes on Purim, where does it come from? What does it symbolize? What's it about? So you probably will hear some kind of Hasidic speech or Hasidic insight that you should know that God concealed himself and therefore we concealed himself. These are nice explanations to go ahead and explain post facto. Meaning, I do not believe that any of these individuals in the late 15th century who started cross-dressing or putting on masks, right, had any intention and any thought that it symbolized. I just don't buy it. What I do believe is as follows, that if you want to go ahead in northern Italy and you want to celebrate, you celebrate the way you celebrate during the Carnival in Venice. And how do you celebrate during the Carnival in Venice? You get dressed up and you have your masks. Jews want to celebrate. So just as the style, just as my jacket, right, was not designed by a Choshev Yid, but nevertheless it symbolizes something, so therefore for Purim, you want to know how to celebrate? Go to Venice, pick it up there. That is what is done. Now you have to realize that there are different communities in Venice, right? There are different communities. And the level of tension in northern Italy, in other words, when it comes to Bonafacio, right, versus Marimins, there was tension between different schools. Venice was known as a city that had an Ashkenazi community and a Sephardi community. I once even saw a paper that discusses if Shylock was an Ashkenazi or a Sephardi. Now, don't answer, right? But there was actually a discussion. Shylock, developed in the imagination of Shakespeare in England. So there's a whole discussion among scholars. What else are they going to do if not discuss if he was an Ashkenazi or Sephardi? That aside, there were different communities there, and there's tension there. And it is very, very possible that just as the issue with the Cherem Rabbeinu Gershom, that Bonafacio perhaps had a Sephardi tradition, here too you could go ahead and tie it in. But at least I give you what I do believe is a little bit about what the spirit of Purim was during that period of time. Okay? So far, we covered a few eras. We're getting into the Ruach. We covered drunkenness. We covered cross-dressing. By the way, you should know that authorities, especially of the 17th century and on, are extremely uncomfortable with the cross-dressing. You have people like Rabbi Yeshayahu Horovitz, known as the Shlah HaKadosh. He uses harsh words. Now, he was affected by Kabbalah. He uses very, very harsh words for cross-dressing. So there have been different schools. The Ramah does mention, as Jews we know that if the Ramah says something, as Ashkenazim at least, we're comfortable, but be aware that it is a very, very detailed discussed issue that is quite fascinating. I'll share with you another discussion. Now, it works as follows. There are many laws that relate to the writing of a Sefer Torah. Many, many, many laws. There's a reason that you pay how much? A sach gel for a Sefer Torah. There are laws about what kind of ink and what you sew it with and how many lines and sirtut. Who is able to write it, who not. Fine. Now, the Gemara tells us that you should know that Megillas Esther is like a Sefer. It's like a Sefer Torah. Nevertheless, there are some leniencies. Because it is also called not just a Sefer, but a Igeret. Okay. So the Talmud spells out a few of those leniencies, not all. Not all. We know that when it comes to the writing of a Sefer Torah, the Halacha tells us that just as with tefillin, women do not write tefillin, even if there would be a situation that a woman that would be familiar with the writing, women do not write tefillin. And there's logic to it. They are not commanded They're not commanded to put it on, so therefore they don't write it. And the rabbis link a Sefer Torah to tefillin. Fine, that's the information that we know. So a Sefer Torah, in general, halachically speaking, a woman would not write a Sefer Torah. There was a rabbi in Prague, a wealthy rabbi, by the name of Rabbi David Oppenheimer. Okay? Rabbi David Oppenheimer is known for his wealth and for his scholarship and leadership. Rabbi David Oppenheimer has a collection of like some 6,000 manuscripts that are currently in Oxford, Bodleian Library, right? And it's known as the Oppenheimer Collection. Rabbi David Oppenheimer was asked a fascinating shaila, and he deals with it. What was his shaila? About a Megillas Esther written by a woman. What's the status? He wonders. Okay. So he mentions this topic. He mentions the discussion and the question about Sefer Torah. Is it like a Sefer Torah? Is it not like a Sefer Torah? And then he shares with us the following, that it seems to me that it's 100% fine. It is 100% permissible for a woman to write a Megillas Esther. And he says that if you look carefully, when the Shulchan Aruch tells us who could and could not, it does not exclude a woman. And then he notes that someone's going to turn to me and say, how can you go ahead and allow something that is not done? How can you allow something? So then he tells us that you should know, a person cannot challenge someone that it's against the minhag if it's something that's not common. And since bedavar she'eino matzui, it is not common. Ki isha bechol ele lo matzati. And he starts sharing here these poetic words about the woman who wrote the Megillah. Like, this woman who wrote the Megillah, I've never found such a woman. It's interesting, very, very nice, very poetic. And he writes that you have a woman that has the keset sofer b'motnea, a woman that liot yodat le'amen yadeh. Now remember, this is early 18th century. Like, tell me what's happening out there, right? About the information that you need for it. There was no school there that provided training for it. So he is amazed at this woman. He's just amazed. And therefore he writes that since it is not common, lo ra'inu eino ra'aya, the fact that we have never seen such a thing is not considered proof. So therefore, u'megillah, it is 100% kshera, ki isha kshera l'chtivat megillah. He gives his stamp of approval with a great amount of excitement and enthusiasm. Now when you read this tshuva, you say, okay, this is a halacha, an interesting halacha, but what's the enthusiasm about? It's always a little bit surprising. But things became clarified later on. Later on, there is a tshuva by a rabbi. His name was Rabbi Eliezer Fleckels, who was late 18th, early 19th century. And he shares a tshuva from his grandfather. And he notes that my grandfather was actually asked as well by Reb David Oppenheim about such a question. So he says that my grandfather, Rabbi Meir Perlis was his name, he brings the question, Nish'al me'et harav hagaon Reb David Oppenheim. He was asked by Rabbi Oppenheim, what's the status of such a Megillah? Megillah, regarding a Megillah, Asher Katva, that was written, what's the next word? Asher Katva, a little bit different. Asher Katva, Bito HaMefursemet, the daughter of Reb David Oppenheim. That was the story. And her name was Sarah. And her husband later on was Chaim Yonah. And the question is, can you use it or not? So suddenly everything becomes very, very clear. This brilliant woman that this Rav is shepping nachas from is basically his daughter. And he has a brilliant daughter who has shimush by her father. And he lets her develop it. She writes a magnificent, boy, would it be nice to get our hands on that Megillas Esther. Imagine the value today, right? Imagine the story with it. Who knows? And therefore, he sheps nachas. Now, I worked out once with ages. She was a teenager at the time. She was perhaps 14 or 15 as she's writing this magnificent Megillah. And it's just something that was interesting to me, but something that, again, halacha l'maaseh, as we have Rav David Oppenheim. Now, let's go into an interesting discussion here that will, yes?
What was the end? A woman can
Reb David Oppenheim says absolutely yes. This Reb Meir Perlis, who we sent the question to, he said absolutely no. And later on, it is quoted by Rab Chaim Yosef David Azulai, who was a great Sephardi rabbinic authority, late 18th century, and he gave his stamp of approval. So therefore, halacha l'maisa would be fine. That's the.
Okay,
Roll up your sleeves. Let's go. Let's go. Interesting. That was the question that was asked. Now, when you compare a Megillas Esther to a Sefer Torah, you have elevated its status, despite the fact that the name of God does not appear there. And the Ramah, for example, tells us that you have to have knowledge when you write a Megillat Esther. And among the pieces of information that he expects you to know is the fact that Kol Parshiotea Stumot. Listen to those words again. When it comes to Megillat Esther, Kol Parshiotea Stumot. In other words, if you look at a Sefer Torah, there are paragraphs. We call those paragraphs Parshiot. Right? What we call a Parsha, it's not the real Parsha. The real Parsha is every single paragraph. The Talmud notes that there are two types of paragraphs. Paragraphs which are open and paragraphs which are closed. A paragraph which is open is one that at the end of the paragraph, there's going to be a gap at the end of the line, meaning you will complete the sofer, will complete the paragraph in the beginning of the line or in the middle, and leave a gap. Okay. When it comes to a parasha stuma, what is done is as follows: that the sofer is very careful to complete the paragraph in the beginning of a line, and on the same line after the gap to start the next paragraph. Parasha stuma, meaning a sealed parasha. Comes the Ramah, and the Ramah tells us that you should know that when it comes to a Megillat Esther, Kol Parshiotea Stumot. This is what we are told. Okay, the Ramah states it. Even though there were probably different opinions, and then over the years there are many variations in writing Sefer Torah. There was a finalized text in the 19th century by a Rabbi Gansfried, who was the author of Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, and he finalized all the different opinions, and when Sofrim want to learn how to write anything, they turn to the work of Rabbi Gansfried, the Keset Sofer, and he states that this is something we don't budge from. Kol Parshiotea Stumot. And there was no question about that until the early 1990s. Again, there was no question about that, right, for the past 400 years, until around 1991, 92. Right? Now, what happened then? It's interesting when we talk about things that suddenly switch. I teach some students, and I mentioned to them the fact that there was a great rabbi by the name of Rabbi Yisrael Meir from Radin, known as the Chafetz Chaim. And we have seen very few pictures of him, and there have never been any footage of him until 2 days ago. And this is something on the internet. They have just discovered, it was sitting somewhere, that during one of these great rabbinic conferences in 1923, there was a person from Fox Media who happened to be there with a camera, probably a little bit larger than the one you have there, and he was filming these old rabbis coming in, and it was discovered, and it was only posted on the web earlier this week. So we finally see footage of the Chafetz Chaim, which is something that's fascinating, that some 80 years after his passing, we are able to see. So we are always curious when there are new developments. So there was a new development in the early 1990s. What was the new development in the early 1990s? So it works as follows. You've all heard of the Aleppo Codex. You've all heard, there's been talks about the Aleppo Codex. There's an excellent book about the Aleppo Codex by a writer for the... Are you okay? Still from the plane. There's a writer, his name, I think Matty Friedman is his name. You read the book? This should be part of the book club. It is, it was, will be. I don't know. But it's an excellent, tragic book in some ways. The Aleppo Codex has its history because it was written in the 10th or the 11th century. It came from the school of Ben Asher, who were extremely precise with their writing of Sefer Torah. Now, it's not a Sefer Torah, but it is a book that gives you all information necessary about how to pronounce things and what Parshiot are Ptuchot and what Parshiot are Stumot. Okay? So now, it's sitting there in Aleppo. Many scholars and many rabbinic authorities were always fascinated simply because the Rambam tells us that when he wrote his own personal Sefer Torah, he relied on what he called, the Keter, the book that originated from Ben Asher. And we know that without a doubt, it was a book that was in Egypt and eventually traveled to Syria in the 14th century and remained there for hundreds of years. So therefore, it was a very significant text, and people were always aware of it and its importance. In 1947, as the United Nations accepts the policy of handing at least a portion of Eretz Yisrael to the Jewish people, there are pogroms there, and what they called the Keter, was like a crown, was concealed. Eventually it lands up in Israel a decade later. Unfortunately, many of the pages are missing. The traditional narrative was that it was damaged by fire when the local Syrians, or a peaceful nation usually, the local Syrians attacked the synagogue and some of the pages were burned. That was the traditional narrative. The newest narrative is the fact that some of the pages, when it was being transferred from Syria to Eretz Yisrael, were stolen. That's what this book of Friedman indicates, which is a very tragic because he blames our people for losing very significant volumes. Among the portions that are missing is Megillat Esther. Megillat Esther is missing. And therefore, it seemed to be that even after the discovery, in 1958, when it was finally in Eretz Yisrael, and scholars and rabbinic authorities were able to look at it, nevertheless, Megillat Esther was information that was lost. Period. Now, people realize that, you know what? Actually, there was once a shaliach who was sent by the great rabbis in Jerusalem in the middle of the 19th century, in the 1850s. There was a shaliach that was sent from Yerushalayim to Syria to go ahead and to look at the Aleppo Codex for one purpose, to figure out Parashat Ptuchot and Stumot. In other words, due to the fact that, yes, there is a very old tradition that dates back to the Ramah, that Megillat Esther, for example, are all Stumot, but nevertheless, if you have a text that is so reliable, that the Rambam himself tells us, this is the one that I relied on, so obviously there would be a great benefit of having that information. So they send a shaliach, they send a messenger, all the way to Syria, and he comes with a Tanakh, and he writes on the side of his Tanakh all the variations between our tradition and this old text, and makes his way back to Yerushalayim. This is a precious Tanakh. Unfortunately, right as he returns, he passed away. He passed away. So from the late 1850s, this Tanakh with his information is lost. So two things are lost here: the actual text and the copy. Now, when I grew up in I didn't grow up anywhere, I grew up everywhere, but as a child, I was in Yerushalayim, okay, from age 10 to age 16. My grandparents lived in a magnificent neighborhood called Kiryat Moshe, a quiet neighborhood in Yerushalayim. And right next to their apartment building in a street called HaMeiri, there was an old structure, an old house, one of those old houses that dates back probably to the Turkish era. And I think it was known as the house that the Mishpachat Yelin owns. I don't know the whole history of it, but it was always there. And then it seems to be that eventually, as the city is developing, and as the proprietor of the house was passed away, it was purchased by a developer to build an apartment building. Okay, so what are they doing there? They're clearing out the attic. And they find, what do they find? Sfarim. They find old books. So if it would be in Toronto, they would have just taken the old books and dumped it by Bnei Torah, like everyone does. Right? They just come, dump it. We've had this week, twice. what's called the dump and run. In some countries, they take babies and they put it by a hospital and run, right? Here in Toronto, they put svarim and they run. And this is actual what's done. So they are, and it's a challenge. We are blessed. It's an era when there are so many svarim. I read about people I've read recently. A fellow by the name of Dinar. He was a minister in Israel at some point. And Dinar learned the tells. And it notes that he had a fascination and he wanted to learn the Ksos, but he couldn't afford a Ksos, which is one sefer. So he decided that due to the fact that he has no choice, he's going to borrow a Ksos and copy all the relevant discussions in the Ksos. In other words, there was an appreciation for every sefer. And now, a sefer is viewed as, oh no, what shul, what yeshiva will take it. It was nice to see that at least the kids here in the yeshiva, they were still excited to go ahead and take. These were all Kabbalistic texts, and not one of them is going to ever understand one word of them. Ginate Gaz of Gilitani. These are real Kabbalistic floating texts, which we call. But nevertheless, there was an excitement for a book. That aside, they have these books. They don't know what to do with it. So they're going to dump it. Across the street, there's a yeshiva called Machon Meir. And as they are going and sorting through what books they're putting in Shemus and which ones not, he picks up a Tanakh, and he looks at the Tanakh, and it's a bright student there, and he says, wait a second, right? He sensed that there's something very significant here. There are notes on the side. He sends it to Hebrew University. And they realize that these are the notes written by Shalom Shachna Yellen in the 1850s that has all the information from the Aleppo Codex. So there was a tremendous amount of excitement. And they go ahead and they start spreading the information. And they realize that, yes, there's an Ashkenazi tradition that they're supposed to be all stumot, but in the Aleppo Codex, I think 6 of them or 9 of them were actually ptuchot. So there's a variation between what the Ramah says and what the book of the Rambam did. So in Bnei Brak, their members of Kol Chazon Ish started writing Megillas Esther with the new adjustment, with the adjustment based on the findings in an attic in Kiryat Moshe, copied from a book in the 1850s from Aleppo, that is a book that's significant due to the fact that the Rambam relied on it. As you can imagine, when you want to make changes in the Orthodox community, right, all excitement breaks loose. And indeed, the amount of literature. So from 1992 to 1997, every single Purim, there's an incredible amount of fascinating tshuvos and people being critical of those who want to change things. There are those that argue. Now, the real issue is as follows. When you have a tradition that is a tradition due to the fact that there was a question mark, and you have to make a decision, is that considered a decision or not? In other words, when the Ramah tells us that the minhag is to make them all stumot, it is not that the Ramah, right, had all a variation of text and he makes a decision based on a proper. Rather, it became the minhag. They weren't sure what to do in Europe, so he says the minhag is you go ahead and make them stumot. So a minhag that's the byproduct of a question mark, is that considered a minhag or not? So those are the two schools. There are those that say it is a minhag, and there are those that say it cannot be a minhag because they have questions. We find the most reliable of texts, the oldest of all Tanakhs. We have here the work that the Rambam himself approved of. So therefore that trumps any of these questionable minhagim. So it became a very, very fascinating discussion, and that became the identity of Purim. It's interesting that there are many good Jews that have a desire to fulfill all halachic requirements to the teeth. They're very, very precise and they're very, very careful. You read Shulchan Aruch, and Shulchan Aruch tells you, Chayav inish levesume ad delo yada. And if you translate it, it seems to be that a person should reach a level of drunkenness until he doesn't recognize. Now, this is a very, very problematic statement. A very, very problematic statement. And some poskim note that this is really against the essence of Judaism, right? To go ahead and become a drunk. And this creates a whole series of problems. In my first year in Memphis, 2003, there were some nice rabbeim there, and they had a yeshiva. And the rabbeim, coming from a yeshiva environment, they got drunk. And all the rabbis in town got a letter from parents. And the parents wrote a magnificent letter. And their letter was, we sent our kids to a Jewish school to learn Jewish values. how on earth can you consider that a Jewish value? And it was a good question. Next year, we tried to deal with the issue. I still remember from Yeshiva, one of the most significant messages our Rosh Yeshiva would get up. And again, you have to imagine this. He's addressing a crowd that, you could say that Shulchan Aruch is like Shulchan Aruch. In other words, this is text that every word is significant. Individuals that are very committed to it. And the Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Levin, would get up and he would say as follows, that you should know, I don't believe in getting drunk. And if any of you are concerned that if you don't get drunk, you are violating the Shulchan Aruch, I take all your sins upon me. That's what he would say. Right? I'll take your Gehenna. Worry not. In other words, if you don't get drunk and you're concerned, I'm going against an halachic statement, it's all on me. Now that was a powerful message. A very, very powerful message. And it's an issue because there have been many, many tragedies. Many, many tragedies. It was actually a student who was a Memphis boy studying in Baltimore in the late 80s. And on Purim, got behind the wheel, and there was a terrible charge. These are things that are extremely, extremely painful. And it is important that when we talk about the identity of a day, we should try to the best of our ability, and I'm talking here to a crowd that can tell others about it. We should try to purge the Leil Shikurim Huzeh Alayla from our form of identification. It doesn't serve Judaism. It doesn't fulfill a mitzvah. It is fine if you're responsible to go ahead and take a little bit. It's 100%. The mitzvah could be fulfilled with a little bit more than usual, which hopefully is very, very little. So that's how the mitzvah could be performed. But that should be our goal, to identify the day as a day of salvation, a day of optimism, a day of overcoming challenge. If you think about next week, right, there's a lot of tension that's been going in to Netanyahu's speech in front of the Congress. These are very, very odd times because we have this traditional balance that existed since 1967 of Europe becoming more and more critical of Israel and the United States balancing it by being very supportive of Israel. That is the way it has been. And even during administrations which have been harsh, the core has not changed. And we have a sense that the core is changing. We have a sense that you could have representatives of the Obama administration using very, very harsh words against Netanyahu and against his speech. And the fact that it's become politicized. And we are nervous. This is not a little bit of a game. And it's, to hear John Kerry saying, that Netanyahu was wrong about, he too was wrong about Iraq in 2003, so he might be wrong again. You hear the idea? There's a country that might be developing a nuclear weapon, and you say, we're going to let them do it because they might not. You hear the idea? You have a neighbor who says he wants to kill you, but he might not be trying to buy a weapon. Yes, there's proof that seems to indicate yes, but remember, he might not, so be calm. That's basically what's being said. So these are times that create a little bit of a challenge. Our identity of Purim should be a time of optimism, a time of hope, a faith that there is something greater, that there's an Almighty that watches over Klal Yisrael, that the fact that we are back, that we have bounced back, that we have a homeland, it's not random. That's what we are fighting. When we talk about, and when we're going to read this Shabbat, the idea of uprooting Amalek, we're not going to run around and trying to look for descendants of Amalek to kill him. That's not what we're going to do. But hopefully what we're going to do is remember that Amalek represents randomness. Asher karcha, everything is mikre. And we are believers that what relates to Klal Yisrael is not a mikre. It's not random. And if it's not random, it means